minutes pass, and looks like still people are rolling in here, and but we're going to get the show on the road. So today, I'm very, very excited actually to have Linda with us to talk about your readiness for a capital campaign. And this is particularly important because just about everywhere I go, people are telling me that they're either in a campaign or in the quiet phase of a campaign, or are thinking about getting into a campaign. So I think you're going to get a lot out of this. Linda has been consulting for over 25 years, and she's one of just a little more than 100 people with the advanced CFRE, advanced fundraising certification. Let's see, I forget what it's called. The
ACFRE.
ACFRE, right. There's so few people, I barely even remember what it's called. And she's trained more than 32,000 people in how to do all of what she's about to go through. So I'm very excited to get this rolling. What we're going to do today is we'll conduct the webinar. Linda's going to give you a ton of information. I hope you have a pencil and paper ready. We are recording this and we'll send it out, but we do wait a couple weeks after the webinar to keep it exclusive. And then I'll come back and I'm going to give you a real quick 1-2 about how MarketSmart supports people like you in their campaigns. And you don't have to stay for that. It is kind of a quickie little sales pitch. But right after that, we'll go into questions and answers and comments from you all. So without further ado, I'm going to change the presenter over here, unless Alvin, my assistant, does it for me, to Linda. So Linda, bear with me just a second.
Okay.
As my computer is freezing just a little bit. Don't worry.
Okay, I think we're set.
Yes. Take it away.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Greg, and thank you all for tuning in today. I have to give you a disclaimer. I'm just recovering from last week. I had laryngitis, had no voice at all. My voice is back, but I may have to stop and take a little coughing fit every now and then, or a sip of water to keep me going. But I love talking about capital campaigns because to me they're very exciting. And when I wrote my book, Capital Campaigns, Everything You Need to Know, I said it's a way to take the pain out of campaign. And I think sometimes you mentioned, Greg, that so many people that you're talking to are either getting ready to go into a campaign, they're in the quiet phase, or they're already in the campaign. And a lot of times what you hear from people is, oh no, another capital campaign. They really don't enjoy it. But I think part of the reason that so many people struggle with campaigns is because they maybe jump into them before they are fully ready. So today we're going to talk about whether or not you're ready for a capital campaign and how you can help get yourself ready so that you come out of the other end of this more successful. And I think, to me, a capital campaign is something that's really exciting because if it's done properly and it's successful, you are not only going to raise the money that you need to build that new building or whatever it is that you're doing, but you're going to have a stronger organization going forward. Your annual fund should increase. Your planned giving should start to surface if it's not already, or it should get stronger if you already have a planned giving program. So a capital campaign accomplishes a lot more than just allowing you to do the bricks and mortar project that you're doing. I want to start with kind of a basic definition of a capital campaign because sometimes people that are new to this field don't even really understand. They say, well, we're going to launch a capital campaign. Well, what are you raising money for? Well, we need to raise $50,000 to expand this one program. Well, that's usually not a capital campaign. It might be some type of a major gift effort or something. But a capital campaign is usually a very significant effort, and for many organizations, maybe the first time you've ever tried to raise this much money at one time. Usually is for major needs like buildings. Sometimes it also is for endowment. In fact, I usually suggest to people if they're building a building to put some money in their goal towards endowment, because usually putting up a new building means increased expenses, and you're going to have to figure out how you're going to cover those increased expenses. So by wrapping endowment into the full-blown capital campaign, it's going to make your life easier in the future. Sometimes people do include program expenses in with their capital campaign. A lot of times organizations run much expensive campaign that is often encompassing um, construction as well as endowment, and maybe incorporates the annual fund into it. There's several schools of thinking, and sometimes it's good to do a comprehensive campaign, because that way you approach people once during the year and they can support your organization's annual giving as well as this special project. But I think what's really you need to be cautious about when you do a comprehensive campaign is I've seen a lot of times where the campaign focuses on the building and the annual needs kind of get secondhand treatment. It's like, oh, by the way, we also need $100,000 for annual operating money. And then when you go back next year to run an annual campaign without when you want to run your annual campaign without capital, it kind of makes it, oh, well, that wasn't very important. We wanted to give to the capital project. We really wanted to build that new library. We don't much care about your ongoing needs. So if you're going to do a comprehensive campaign, it's really important that your case makes a strong case for both annual giving as well as the endowment and the construction needs. So how does a capital campaign fit into the donor pyramid? Well, this has been around for years and years, I think since I've been in fundraising, at least that long. And I think a lot of people understand this, that capital campaigns usually fall towards the top of that pyramid, that you're not going to, in most cases, you're not going to go out and raise a lot of money from people that are going to support a building project if you haven't already laid the groundwork at the bottom of this. If you don't have awareness, people don't know who your organization is, if you don't already have an annual campaign. It's not impossible to do it. I've done it for many organizations that have not had the bottom of that pyramid in place, and they were successful in raising money, but only because they really approached it properly. But normally, I think the reason it's important to look at this in the overall scheme of things is to realize that while you're running a capital campaign, you can't forget this other part of this donor pyramid, because you need the public relations and the special events. You need the annual giving. You need the planned giving. And it can be very dangerous to stop all your other fundraising and try to focus strictly on a capital campaign. In fact, I once worked for an organization, and after I left there, this organization did hold a capital campaign, and somebody decided, and I know they went against their consultant's advice, because the consultant would not have advised them to do that, but they decided that they were not going to run an annual appeal that year because they wanted to focus all their energy on the capital campaign. Well, the capital campaign was going very well, but I happened to talk to one of the board members who said, oh my gosh, we just had a special board meeting because they're thinking about closing the doors 2 or 3 days a week because we don't have enough money to operate on. The campaign's going well, but that money's all restricted for construction. So you really want to be careful in a campaign mode that you don't neglect any other aspect of your fundraising, and that's why it's so important to do this right. So what's involved in most capital campaigns? Well, there's a lot of different things. First of all, there's sound research, and this can be 2 different types of research. First of all, you want to do some research, maybe a study in your community, some type of a needs assessment, to see if the community really feels like this building that you want to build or renovate, whatever, is really necessary, and it takes some strategic planning and things like that to have in place. But then you also have to research your potential donors, because without potential donors, you're not going to be very successful. So you have to really incorporate this into your long-range planning efforts and show people how this campaign is going to allow you to fulfill a vision for the future. People don't give just because you're building a new building or you're trying to raise money for an endowment. They give because of the people that are going to be served in that building. So you want to make sure that this building fits into your long-range strategic plan and show people how in order to accomplish your vision, you need this new building or this renovated building or whatever it is you're raising money for. Persuasive campaign literature is always used in a capital campaign. But my one word of caution is make sure that you don't spend all your time and effort putting together literature before you really have studied the community and found out whether or not this program is going to be viable. I worked with one organization once that had a huge gift of land. It was worth like $70 million. I mean, it was in a place where land was very expensive, and they wanted to do some construction, and at the same time they were working with a marketing company and they were working with me to do their feasibility study to find out if the community would support this campaign. Well, their marketing company said, oh, you need a video and you need a big glitzy brochure to show these people when you're out interviewing them. And I said, no, that's not really going to help you because you're talking to these people in the very, very early stages, and you're trying to find out if they're going to buy into this before you invest into a brochure that says this is a done deal, this is what we're going to do. Sometimes in the studying process, you find that maybe people don't really think you need that particular building, or maybe that location is not good, or maybe you're trying to raise too much money or not enough money. So the literature is important, but don't try to tackle it too early in the campaign because otherwise you're going to end up showing people that you have a done deal and then you're asking them for their opinion on whether or not you should do it. And that really can set people off. That particular organization that I mentioned never did get a successful campaign off the ground because they really didn't have enough support for this building, even though they had spent a lot of money and the material they produced was really nice, but it was just premature. So make sure that you take the steps in the right process, and we're going to talk about that. You also need to have an effective organization. If your organization is not doing a good job already with its programs, people are going to be very reluctant to want to support you going forward in a capital campaign if you can't prove to them that you have a success ratio, that you have good outcomes already in place. So make sure that your organization is operating at top level before you decide to try to campaign. Another thing that's important is application of proven procedures. And I know that probably everybody on this phone call is thinking, well, we're different, we're unique. And yes, you are different and you are unique. But there are some truisms in capital campaigns that always are going to work, and there are some things that are never going to work. One of those things is the fallacy of everybody giving their fair share. Well, all we need is 1,000 people to give $1,000 and we can raise $1 million. And I can tell you that I have never, ever, ever seen a campaign work like that. There's always people that can give at top levels that can give $100,000, and then there's other people that can give 10,000, and others that can give 1,000, and others that can give 100. So that's a proven procedure in campaigns that you need to develop a plan and a scale of gifts that allows everybody to. A procedure that always works is working, what we call working from the top down and working from the inside out, which means working from the top down is that you go after those big gifts first. Once you get the $1 million gift or the $100,000 gift or the $10 million gift, depending on the size of your campaign, the smaller gifts will fall into place. But if you try to run a campaign starting with a general campaign that you just do direct mail or something to approach a lot of people for small gifts, you won't be able to then go back and get those big gifts. And I can tell you that I've seen organizations try this and it doesn't work. Working from the inside out means you always, always, always start with your board, your staff, your campaign cabinet, the family of your organization, and get their buy-in first before you start writing proposals to foundations and approaching corporations and the general populace of your community. So there's certain procedures that are always true in a capital campaign, even if your organization is unique and different. Careful scheduling and publicity is really critical. As I said, you don't want to come across like this is a done deal too soon in the game. You want to make sure that you schedule and follow the steps that are proven to work, and then publicize the campaign at the right time, because that's really critical. The one thing that makes a capital campaign different from other fundraising that you do, and a lot of what you're learning today in capital campaigns, you're going to find helpful in your annual campaign too. So it's not just for a once and done thing. I hope you'll take these lessons, and even if you decide you're not ready for a capital campaign, you'll be able to put some of these things in place. But a capital campaign is something that has a very specific time period. Most campaigns run a year and a half, 2 years. For very large campaigns, they might run 3 or 4 years. But usually, for an average campaign, I find that about a year and a half to 2 years is a pretty good time frame. But it's not like your annual giving that once it's done, you have to start it all over again. And if you didn't make your goal this year, you can make it next year. This is a very specific time period that you have to raise this money. And you also have to work with a prescribed budget. You have to have enough money in the budget to do the things that are going to be done. You need to probably hire a consultant. You need to hire a marketing firm to do your materials, your videos, your CDs, your brochures, whatever you decide to put together. So all of this is very timely, and I think it's really important. There's a couple what I call the keys to success, though, that really make or break every capital campaign, and these are the things that I want to talk about, whether or not you're ready or not. And one of the first things in there is having a solid infrastructure in place. And by that I mean, do you have ethical standards in your organization? And you might not think this is going to be as important as you might think it is, but ethical standards are critical, because you're asking people in a capital campaign to give large sums of money, maybe larger than you've ever given before, and they want to know that your organization is ethical and above board. So I think that's an important part of your infrastructure. Donor software. Do you have some kind of software system in place that's going to allow you to manage the campaign? For many small organizations, if they've never done a capital campaign, they may never have actually received a pledge before. All their money is either an event where the money comes in the door that night or before the event, or it's a direct mail appeal that people respond to right away. And they maybe never have taken a 3-year pledge before. So you have to have a software system that's going to allow you to maintain and track pledges. If somebody makes a 3-year pledge, to make sure that they're going to get reminders in those 3 years, that type of thing. You're also going to need an annual giving history. And as I said, this isn't quite as critical as some of the other things. I've done successful capital campaigns for people that have never raised money on an annual basis. But I can tell you that it's going to be a lot harder, and it's going to take you a little more time, because you have to start that identification of donors and cultivation of donors and getting them to give their very first gift to a capital campaign may be a little bit harder. So if you have a strong annual giving history, that's going to help you a lot. You also need to have gift acceptance policies in place, and this is one of those things that you should have in place for any fundraising that you do. But it's even more important, I think, in a capital campaign, because you might have someone, and I've had this happen several times, where someone offered a gift of land to build a project for a client of mine, And they were all excited until they did their due diligence and found out that it was going to cost them $500,000 to remediate the soil on that land because it had been a former gas station. So you want to make sure that you have a set of policies in place that say what type of gifts you're going to receive during this campaign. Gifts in kind are great if they're going to actually help the campaign, but some gifts in kind maybe don't really pertain to this capital campaign. If you get someone to donate excavating and cement and furniture and, you know, glass for their windows, that type of thing, those probably will help your campaign. But make sure you have these gift acceptance policies in place before you go into this. You want staff support, and lots of times development staff in small shops especially are really stretched to the limit, and they're trying to run 10 special events a year and write grants and do everything else. You've got to be able to have the support in this in house that's going to allow you to manage a campaign. And in some cases, you might need approval of regulatory authorities. In many states, if you've never done any fundraising before, you may not be registered, or you may not be registered in the states that you're required to. Maybe this capital campaign, you think, well, we're going to reach out a little bit broader audience. We're located in Nevada, but we're going to go raise money in California. Well, if you're going to go raise money in California, you better be registered there. Or if you're part of a national organization, they may need to approve you doing a capital campaign. Or if you receive money from United Way, they may be required to approve when you're going to run the campaign and how you're going to get out there and raise this money. So it is important to have all these things in place first. There's a couple things, though, that I think are really critical. These are all things that can be fairly easily dealt with. You know, you can develop gift acceptance policies. You can Google it and look at other people. There's an amazing number of them that are actually available on the internet. You can get the approval of the regulatory authorities usually pretty easily. But these are the things that, to me, are the real pillars of success and that you really need to focus on. So most of my discussion here is going to focus on some of these things. But board commitment. Is your board fully committed to doing this campaign? If the board says, well, we don't really think this is important and we're not going to support it financially, you're probably not going to succeed. So you want that board commitment. You have to have a compelling case for support. That's really critical in this whole thing. And of course, you have to have prospective donors who's going to support this campaign. That's really critical. And then effective volunteer leadership. And I want to focus on these areas because I think these are some of the areas that without this in place, you're not going to be successful. And the organizations that I've worked with that have been a little lacking in things like annual giving history, they were successful because they had these things in place. So you can overcome a lot if you have some of the right things in place. So how do you start planning for a campaign? Well, there's really three different kinds of planning involved. One is pre-campaign planning, the other is the planning study, and then the campaign plan itself. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these. The pre-campaign planning, usually what I recommend is that you appoint a steering committee, and this is not the big, large committee that's going to help you raise money. This is a committee that gets in on the ground floor, the people that look at things like working with the architects and the builders and maybe a construction management company, looking at the organization's internal readiness to do a campaign. They may say, gosh, we ought to really do a full-blown development audit to see if we're ready to do this, or at least get a consultant from the outside to come in and look at our internal readiness to do a campaign. This group also usually works with the actual project plan and the budget. How much is it going to cost and how are we going to finance? We may need to do some short-term financing while we're waiting for pledges to be paid. They're the people who typically approve the preliminary the consultant and work with them to develop that case for support. And these are also the people that decide, do we need to do a planning study or not? In most cases, you probably will, but I have done some successful campaigns where they haven't done a planning study, but for very good reasons. So the thing that you want to do is look at whether or not you're ready for a capital campaign. And if anyone would like to see this, I do have a capital campaign readiness questionnaire. It's a very simple thing that you can kind of do yourself before you bring in a consultant. It's about 20 questions, I think, that kind of ranks you on whether or not you're actually ready to do a campaign. So at the end, I'm going to give you my email, and if you're interested, you can take that survey and just kind of see where you are, because it'll be interesting to see internally, and you might want to hand it to a couple different people and ask them to fill it out and see if they all agree. Some people might, maybe your staff thinks you're ready, but your board doesn't, or vice versa. So I think that tool will help you tremendously. I want to go back to software requirements because I think this is so critical to a campaign. Some of the things that you, and there's probably everybody on here is using some different software package, and I'm not promoting any one in particular, but just giving you some ideas of some things that you want to be able to do with your software. And if you can't do this currently, you may need to think about, gosh, we better buy something else before we start this campaign. So one of the things you want to be able to do is sort your campaign coding by what division is someone in. We'll talk a little bit more about divisions, but division and maybe an alumni division, depending on your organization. And you want to know where all your prospective donors are and who's going to solicit them. It's important to track the success of the solicitors that you have. You should be able to do mail merges for personalized mail appeals. Generate pledge reminders and acknowledgments. As I said, a lot of times this is the first time somebody has taken a pledge, and you might have someone that wants a 3-year pledge, but they want to pay you monthly. So that means 36 times you have to acknowledge them and maybe remind them. You also are going to need some reports, like reports by different solicitors, so you can say, well, gee, Sally was supposed to call on these 4 people, and we've only gotten a gift from one. I wonder where she is on the other 3, and then you pick up the phone and call Sally. Cash flow projections are important. If you do get that short-term financing, most people are ready to break ground and start construction before all their pledges are paid, because they typically have either 3-year or 5-year pledges. And if you go to the bank and say, we need a construction loan, the first thing they're going to ask you is, well, how many pledges do you have in your campaign and when are they going to be paid? And if you have to sit and calculate that all manually, it's going to take a couple weeks of your time probably. But a good software system will let you do that. So I think those things are really important. We talked about the gift acceptance policies. It's not only what type of gifts that you will accept, but how are you going to use those gifts? Maybe you're building a new soup kitchen and somebody offers you a $1 million painting, a Picasso or something, and you say, well, I don't think we want that hanging in the soup kitchen, so we're going to dispose of it. We're going to sell it and apply that money to our campaign. Is that okay with a donor if we do that? So you have to know how you're going to use those gifts and how you will dispose of the ones that might not make sense for you, and how you're going to manage those gifts while they're under your control. If you get a big gift in early and you're not ready to start construction yet, then you have to invest that somehow. So those are some things to think about in your gift acceptance policies. And also in a capital campaign, you'll want recognition policies on, how much is it going to cost to name the building? How much is it going to cost to name a room in the building or a wing in the building, whatever you might have. So all these things have to be in place. I mentioned how important board responsibilities are, and we all like to have board members that have affluence and influence. Some consultants will tell you that the board should give 1/3 of a goal in a capital campaign. I can tell you I've probably maybe once in my life worked with a board that could do that. Most of the time they don't have that much affluence and influence, but every board member should be willing to support this at a meaningful level. And that may be different to everybody on your board. One person on your board may be able to give $50,000 and another may be able to give $50, but it's really important that 100% of your board members financially support this campaign. Um, but even if they can't financially support you at the level that others can, they may have access to potential donors. And every board member can get out there and help you promote the organization and promote the campaign. Some of your board members should be willing to serve on the campaign cabinet and serve as campaign leaders, but you don't want your campaign cabinet to just be your exact on your board. You want to bring in some outside people as well. But you should have, depending on the size of your board, I would say at least 3 or 4 people who are willing to serve on this capital campaign and kind of be the liaison between the campaign cabinet and the board. Now, the development staff functions, I mentioned that you're going to need to make sure you have staff support. And there's a lot to do during a capital campaign. Some people actually hire temporary staff because somebody has to coordinate all the meetings and events that take place during a campaign. Somebody has to prepare the reports for the board, for the CEO, for the campaign cabinet, and maybe for the bank too. Um, Somebody has to support the volunteers that you're going to be working with. One of the things about a capital campaign is it's usually the most volunteer intensive fundraising that any organization ever does. But volunteers need a lot of support. You can't just say, okay, go out there and raise the money and not give them the support that they need. You have to have someone doing internal communications, making sure everybody within the organization understands the importance of this capital campaign and what it's going to mean for the organization. And so that if they get questions about it, they know who to refer it to. And then external communications. You might get calls from the media that want to do a story about your project or about your organization. So you need to have somebody that can do all of those things. And just the clerical support behind mailings at the end of the campaign, you'll probably do a mail appeal, acknowledgement, reminders, all of those things take time. So if you don't have a staff person that can manage all this, um, these are things that usually a consultant won't do for you. Some consultants are more hands-on, but after talking to a consultant and looking at your staff, if you still find you need somebody, then you might want to think about hiring a part-time or a temporary person to help with this campaign. Campaign volunteers to me are the most critical aspect of a successful campaign. If I listed all the campaigns I've been involved with and which ones were the most successful and went over their goal. And then I made a list of which ones had the best campaign volunteers. They would probably match, because to me, you can overcome a lot of things if you have good campaign volunteers. So you usually start with a campaign cabinet that, depending on the size of your campaign and the size of your organization, most of the cabinets I've worked with have been maybe 20 to 30 people, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but on an average, I would say people. And what that cabinet consists of is you look at all the campaign committees that you're going to have, and the chairperson of each of those committees is a campaign cabinet member. So usually you have divisions, um, like leadership gifts, major gifts. Sometimes in a small campaign, this can be combined and it's leadership and major gifts together because the size isn't that much different. But if you're doing a very large campaign, you may even have another level in there. Sometimes there's a small business campaign. As I said, it's different for every organization. You might have an alumni division, a parents division. If you're a statewide group, you might have regional divisions. But it has to be customized for your organization and what's appropriate for you. And then you'll have event committees. Now, these are the people who are not involved in direct solicitation, but they're doing events, and I don't mean fundraising events. A capital campaign is no place for a fundraising event, but you might do a kickoff event to announce things to people. You might do a dedication, a groundbreaking, a recognition event at the end, and it depends on the timeline and what works for each organization. Sometimes the kickoff event is the groundbreaking, or sometimes it's actually the recognition event. So you have to kind of time it depending on what works for your organization. And then we usually recommend a public relations committee. Now, if you're a very large organization with a huge PR department, you might not need this. Maybe you have internal people that can handle it. But if you're a small grassroots organization, you might want to try to get some media people, some uh, advertising agencies, some groups like that understand public relations that can help you promote the campaign. This is usually the committee that works with your marketing firms and your graphic designers on what do we want to put on the website to communicate about this campaign, and do we need brochures, and do we need videos. So if you don't have a strong PR department that can handle it, you'll probably want to get some volunteers on that. Same way with a finance committee. If you have a CFO and a big finance department that can handle things like going to the bank and getting the construction loan, developing a budget, you may not need this. But if not, if you're a small grassroots, maybe again, getting some CPAs and bankers on this committee would help you develop the finances for the campaign. And the same is true of a building committee. Some organizations have a big facilities department and they have people internally that can handle this, or maybe they have a strong facility committee on the board. But if not, you might want to appoint a building committee on your campaign that can deal with the architects and construction managers and zoning boards and all that type of thing. So what do campaign volunteers do? Well, in most cases, well, they always guide the campaign, but in some cases they actually are more involved in guiding the project, like the construction and things like that. They help you identify prospective donors. And this is why bringing in more volunteers than just your board is important, because this opens up more avenues to you. It gives you more networks, more avenues to get out and find prospective donors. They can help you cultivate prospective donors too. Some people maybe don't want to serve on a campaign cabinet because they don't want to ask for money, or they don't think they're good at it, or maybe they're also they just got done serving on another campaign, so they don't want to be associated with going out and raising the money, but they might be able to help you cultivate donors and identify donors. Um, the other nice thing about campaign volunteers is these people are going to help you identify other volunteers. In most cases, most of the campaigns I've been involved with, if you take into account everybody that volunteered for this campaign down to, from the campaign chair down to the people who made phone calls and stuffed envelopes, we usually have 200 to 300 volunteers. But you don't have to go out and find 200 to 300 volunteers. What you need to do is get the right campaign cabinet in place, and then they will go out and find people that they want to work with that will help them. So let's say you've identified somebody to chair the leadership gift phase. That person may say, well, gosh, I'd like to work with Joe, and I'd like to work with Ann because I worked with them before and they're really good at this, so I'm going to invite them on my committee. So it's not something that you have to go out and do all this volunteer recruitment yourself. We always, of course, ask volunteers to give money, and this is a sticking point that sometimes people have with even their annual giving. Oh, we don't want to ask our board and volunteers for money because they give their time. Well, if they're giving their time, that means they really care about your organization. So wanting you to succeed means that they'll want to also contribute financially. And then most of your volunteers are going to be involved in asking for money. As I said, there may be some like the PR committee or events committee involved in asking for a gift, but most of them should be willing to do that. Now, the other group that I think people always struggle with is, do we need a consultant to do this campaign, or can we do this campaign without hiring a consultant? And most people do hire a consultant when they're doing this for several reasons. First of all, it's probably, as I said, the largest amount of money that you've ever raised. And because you have such a large amount at stake, you might be really concerned. And you're also dealing with that limited amount of time. And this is really important that you set up a time frame that says you're going to start this campaign on whatever date, January 1st, 2017, but you're going to end it by December of 2018. Because I can tell you that organizations who drag out capital campaigns and I've seen some that drag them out for 10, they're never very successful because people get tired of it. They don't want to see a campaign that, oh my gosh, are they still raising money for that thing? They're never going to do it. And nobody has confidence in you then because they don't think you're ever going to be able to raise the money. And of course, you also don't want to fail publicly. That's another thing that makes a capital campaign different from other fundraising. Annual fundraising goal is $300,000 and you raise $285,000, probably nobody in the public will know that you fell short. You may have to look at plan B and say, okay, how are we going to make up this deficit? Or are we going to have to cut back programs? Or are we going to come up with some creative ways to raise money? But with a capital campaign, you announce that goal publicly. And once you've raised that awareness of people, and you've said, we're trying to raise $10 million, sure, everybody's going to know it. So, and I'm not saying that hiring a consultant is going to stop that. It doesn't guarantee you success, but a lot of people just feel like they don't have the time or the talent to experiment with it. They want to rely on somebody that's going to help them get through this campaign in the time that's required. But one thing that's important to remember is that consultant is not out there to raise money for you. I think a lot of times when people hire a consultant, they ask the questions like, well, do you have the list? Or can you get us to the Gates Foundation or Oprah Winfrey? Or, I mean, every consultant has heard this probably a million times, so I know they've all heard as much as I have. The consultant is not going to raise money, and they're not there to build relationships with themselves and your donors. They're there to build relationships between you and your donors. So you don't want the consultant going out and asking for money. And when you are interviewing consultants, you don't want to say, well, you know, how much money have you raised from so-and-so? Because you wouldn't want the consultant taking your donor to the next person that they work with. So you shouldn't expect them to do that with the last person that they worked with either. So it's important to remember that the consultant is like a coach. They're going to guide you through the process, but they're not going to raise the money for you. So what does a consultant typically do in a campaign? Well, that internal readiness that we talked about, this is sometimes a full-blown development audit, or it should at least be some type of an internal readiness to see what you need to improve on internally. And that's something that's due. I mean, I'm giving you some tools that you can start it, but it's oftentimes really hard for an organization to look at itself internally and say, gee, you know, this is what we're doing wrong and this is what we're doing right. A feasibility or planning study, and those words can be used interchangeably. I prefer the word planning study, but a lot of people use feasibility study because it's more commonly used. That's the external readiness of your communities to support your campaign. And this is where a consultant helps, because a lot of times people won't talk to you as readily as they will to an outside consultant because they know it's confidential information, and you're going to go back and say, hey, do you know what Sally Jones said about your CEO or about your board chair? The consultant is going to report if there are trouble areas, but they're not going to reveal any confidential information received from someone they interviewed. Um, a lot of times a consultant is needed for the planning and organization part. And if your budget is limited and you say, we can't afford a consultant, my advice is always look at these first three things um, and say, this is where I think we can spend some money on a consultant. If a consultant can do the planning for you and lay out a good campaign plan, maybe you can implement it yourself. And I can speak for probably every consultant that I know and say we would much rather be brought in at the beginning and say, well, we only have X number of dollars, so can we pay you to do the study and to do a campaign plan for us? But that's all we can afford. I would much rather hear somebody say that than call me after the campaign has already been running for a year or two or three or 10 and say, we're really messing up here. Can you come in and save us? Because that's really almost impossible to do. I mean, you can jumpstart a stalled campaign, but sometimes you've already made so many mistakes that a consultant can't fix it. So if you're going to hire somebody, hire them to do the early phases if you can't afford them through the whole campaign. Case development, you may have somebody internally that can write your case, and that's fine. The consultant may just review it and give you some advice. If you are like a lot of small organizations, maybe the consultant will write the whole case for support. I can tell you most of my clients, I've actually written their cases for support. Donor screening is something that sometimes people feel uncomfortable with, and so they might bring in a consultant to do that. And volunteer training. Sometimes it's hard for a staff member to say, oh gosh, you volunteers have to give too, besides going out and raising money, where a consultant can easily say that. And then just the communications between the development office and the CEO and the board, those things are all important. So when you're thinking about a campaign, if you haven't already hired a consultant, think about what you really need them to do. Maybe you can do some of these things yourself and ask them, are they willing to work on a as needed basis? Years ago, everybody brought in what they called resident counsel, and they came in and really lived at your organization for 6 months to a year. It was outrageously expensive, and most people either can't afford that or they don't need it because they already have a professional staff. They don't need somebody there every day guiding the whole process. So talk to consultants and find out what it is that they feel like they can do for you, and then determine what it is that you need. I want to spend a couple minutes talking feelings around that feasibility. In most cases, what I have found is that most organizations really do need to do this unless you've run capital campaigns before, unless you know that you have a strong base of support and that you have leadership donors. Most of the time, a planning study is needed because it helps not just look at the overall goal, but it helps you look at your internal readiness, look at the timeline of the campaign. If the study comes back and shows that donors really aren't very aware of your organization and you need to do more marketing or more cultivation before you run a campaign, the study should show that. If you think you can raise X number of dollars, let's say you think you can raise $10 million and the study shows you can probably only raise 5. Well, you might still, with a lot of hard work, be able to raise 10, but most of the time a study is based on the consultant's experience with other communities, with other organizations, maybe with your own community, and they're usually pretty good at coming up with whether or not the goal is reasonable or not. But another great thing about a study is it comes up with some good leadership possibilities because the consultant is going to ask questions like, would you be willing to serve in a leadership capacity on this campaign? And if that person says no, well, is there any capacity you would like to serve? And I've often had people who say, well, I can't really get too involved, but I will be willing to make 4 or 5 calls. And well, if there are 4 or 5 calls to the right people, that's an important asset that I've gotten from that volunteer. But they also then will ask, do you know other people we should be talking to that might be interested in this? And lots of times the consultant will find through this process that, let's say you're an organization that serves autistic kids and they're out interviewing a business leader, and that business leader says, well, I don't think I can get involved, but my employee has an autistic child and I think she'd be really great to work on this campaign. So a lot of times that kind of information comes out of the woodwork, which would be really hard to pull out without a study. So the benefits are it kind of helps pre-sell your campaign, and it does attract key leadership. People like to be in on the ground floor, and if you've called on them to get their advice, the chances are they're going to want to get involved going forward. So it helps you strengthen those relationships that you already have with donors because you are calling on them and you're asking for their advice and they're feeling really tied into your organization. But it also might help you make new friends. Some of the people interviewed in a study usually aren't real familiar with your organization. They may be on the list because they are a business leader in town or a political leader in town, and sometimes they don't know much about you. But I can tell you, all the studies that I've done, I would say probably about a good 25 to 35% of the people I interviewed have said something like this to me at the door on the way out. I'm glad you came because I didn't know that much about this organization, and I'm really happy to learn more. So it does help you gain some new friends as well. And it helps raise the sights because in the study process, people are going to see that scale of gifts and say, oh, wow, I didn't realize you were trying to raise this much money, so you're going to need some big gifts to do that. And it takes that fair share concept away where you get these people who think, well, sure, they can raise $1 million by getting 1,000 people to give $1,000. That doesn't work. When they see that scale of gifts, they understand that you need to raise more money, and so it supports that need for those lead gifts. So I think those are some of the benefits of doing a study. The process basically usually starts with an internal assessment of your internal readiness, and then development of a preliminary case for support. And we always call it preliminary because remember, we're there to get people's advice, not their money. And you might find that something you think is really important is not as important to your donors. So it's a preliminary case for support. And then we determine who should be interviewed. And that's a really important process. If you don't interview the right people, your study isn't going to be very helpful. Letters are sent out to the interviews, usually on your letterhead, and signed by somebody, maybe the chair of your board, saying that we're going to be doing this and we'd like you to participate in an interview. And then the interviews are scheduled sometimes by the consultants and sometimes by the organization. This is something that needs to be worked out with you and the consultant as to who's the best person to schedule interviews. And then the interviews themselves are always conducted by the consultant who will prepare a report and present it to your board. So most planning studies, as I said, they should always be done by outside counsel. First of all, be as open with you as they will be to a stranger, or at least someone who's outside your organization, but also because the outside counsel knows the questions to ask and knows how to interpret the answers and knows how to observe what's going on with this person, and maybe even though they're not saying something, they're indicating by their body language or some other method what they're really thinking. They're conducted one-on-one. We never take staff people along on interviews. When I say one-on-one, of course, if you're interviewing a couple, it's one-on-two, I guess. And there should normally be done face-to-face. I've occasionally done some interviews by phone when it just didn't make sense. I had a client that had a major donor in Rome, and I just couldn't talk him into sending me to Rome to go interview him. But in most cases, it'll be face to face, and it is confidential information. And this is why it's important to have a consultant do this, because they're not going to tell you, who said what. Sometimes people can figure that out just by the responses if they really know their donors. I remember one time delivering a report, and I said, there was some concern about this, and they all said, "Oh yeah, that was so and so." They all knew who said it, just based on the comment. And typically it's about 30 to 50 interviews. In a large campaign, you might be interviewing a lot more people than that. I very seldom have interviewed. I don't know if I've ever interviewed less than 30, maybe like 28 or something, but most of the time it's about 30 to 50 interviews. And usually it takes at least 3 months, or I would say 4 months. And if it's a big campaign, a big project, and a lot of travel is required, it might take more. And I'm giving you some average cost. This is not, hard and fast, but I'm just based on consultants that I've worked with and that I know. Most of the time, they charge you between $30,000 and $50,000 to do a study, so that's kind of what you can figure on. So before we open it up to questions, I did want to give you a couple special offers. First of all, the 2 books that I have written is, the book itself is Capital Campaigns, Everything You Need to Know. And then Are You Ready for a Capital Campaign is a workbook that will kind of guide you through a lot of things that you can put in place yourself. It really helps you do that internal assessment. And you can get a 15% discount on those books if you use the code lowercase Linda15, and you can either go to my website or the charity channel, that's the publisher's website, and do it there. I also wanted to let you know that I'm going to be doing a whole 6-week course in sometime in early 2017 on this that really kind of guides you through the workbook and the book as well. So if anybody's, I don't have the details on when it's going to start or the price or anything, but if you're interested in that and you just email me, I'll add you to the list and send you information as soon as I get it. So I did want to give you my email. My email is linda@lindalysakowski.com. I think I forgot. I had it on the last slide. But you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. I also have Pinterest too, but I don't know if you're interested. That's not usually mostly business related. So those are some ways that you can get in touch with me. So maybe I should put that slide back up with my email on it just in case anybody didn't get a chance to get that down. So Greg, do we have some questions in the queue? I know you have some closing comments too.
Yeah. Thank you so much. First, we're going to just do a little 1-2 on how MarketSmart supports these kinds of campaigns, and then I've got 3 questions so far. So to the listeners out there, if you'll please, type in your questions. I'm only going to take a minute or 2 to show you a couple things. Of course, if you want to learn more about us, that would be great. So yeah, I'm going to jump in and do that right now. I hope you can all see my screen. I'm assuming, Linda, you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
All right, cool. So what we do, we're a technology company, and our mission is to help nonprofits raise more money at lower cost. Where that begins is with our free fundraising report card, which is in my humble opinion, is an amazing widget that's free, and it's synced with a whole bunch of different data or CRM companies. But primarily you'll, like little green light, kindful, neon, but most people will just download 3 data fields, which is donor IDs, donations, and dates of each donation, and they upload them to get hundreds of really cool little charts. I won't go through all of them because there's just too many, but you can see your retention rate, your reactivation rate, upgrades, downgrades, acquisition rate, all this stuff. And what's cool is you can play with it to see, like, okay, who are the 25 donors in 2014 15 that made up 32% of our revenue. You know, and then you can even export that, or you can go down and see, okay, well, who are the 1,100 donors that made up 28% of our revenue, and so on and so forth. And there's all kinds of ways that you can play with this and get them ready for board meetings or for preparation of you know, determining whether you really have in your database file get over the hump for the capital campaign. So that's number one. That's kind of an entry point, and since it's free, there is a paid version, but since it's free, a lot of people like to use that, and we have people all over the world using it. What MarketSmart does at its core, furthermore, in addition to that, is we really help teams, board members, but mostly major gift officers and planned gift officers figure out not only who they should target, which is usually done screening and all that, but we add a layer to it that's never been done before in the sector, which is we basically help you do your donor discovery through technology, and it's exponentially less expensive, and it helps you zero in on why people care per each individual's verbatims. And we also track their engagement with your organization, each individual. We track where they click, how long they click, what videos they look at, things like that. So all of this goes into a dashboard and creates a really, really powerful 360-degree profile of each individual donor, and helps tee them up for you so that you're spending more time with highly qualified leads and getting down into serious conversations rather than spending so much time hunting and pecking and qualifying prospects. So we do this by gathering two types of data, which are the verbatims, usually from donor surveys, and tracking their digital body language online. And together, these combine with your recency, frequency, monetary value of past giving, and the wealth screening, if you even do that. Frankly, we find that this kind of monitoring trumps any of that, that kind of data anyway. And it helps you move, or I should say, deal with the marketing funnel, because otherwise, this funnel is just too big for an individual fundraiser, and frankly, the marketing department, if you try to get them involved, is kind of too busy with events or annual fund. So we kind of help you eliminate all the tedious and hard work at the awareness and the interest stage, so that we get the fundraiser zeroed in at the stage when people are ready. So I'm going to wrap this up by saying that we do this with a process and some patented software and new technologies that all begin with our donor survey platform, which is like SurveyMonkey but on massive steroids, and an artificial intelligence and machine learning unit that takes the information that the donors tell us in the surveys, and it immediately creates or spins off drip email messages that are highly relevant and personalized and automated, but look like they are coming directly from you or someone else on your staff, to help move people through the consideration process and give them recency scoring of how recently they've been online, engaging with your mission, and the likelihood that they will give based on our algorithm that scores their interests, their verbatims, and their digital body language, which all gets found in our dashboard. So that's what we do to help support and build caseloads for gift officers, for capital campaigns. We also have used our donor survey as part of a feasibility study, or several feasibility studies, and so on and so forth. So with that, I'll invite everyone, of course, to please consider getting a more detailed demonstration of what we do, and we can show you case studies. We work with hundreds of nonprofits, both large and small, but I won't continue this little sales pitch anymore. Instead, I'm going to get to the questions. And I will, in fact, I'll get out of this. And let me pull up the first question here, if you bear with me. Linda, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. I've heard that we'll need to get leadership gifts that make up at least 50 to 60% of the goal, and I'm concerned that we don't have people capable of such big gifts in our file. What should we do? We don't want to give up before we even get started.
I think that's a great question. And the leadership gifts, I think it's not so important that they total 50 to 60%. What is important is that you raise that 50 to 60% of your goal through some method before you announce it publicly. In fact, I usually tell people to try to raise between 60 and 80%, but they don't all have to be leadership gifts. I don't know what size your campaign is, but some of those might be leadership gifts, and some might be what I would call major gifts, which is the next tier down from the leadership gift, but it's still a significant gift, because from the general public, you'll probably only be able to raise maybe 30% or so, maybe at the most. So I would try to look at maybe breaking up into leadership gifts and then major gifts. Let's say I'm just going to pull some figures that maybe you've determined a leadership gift is $100,000 or more, but then there may be people that fall in the next category of a major gift, which might be between 25 and 100,000. So if together you can have the leadership and the major gifts total that, I think you'll be okay.
Great. All right, thank you. We have two more, unless others roll in. Feel free to type in your questions in the question box. Let's see. We have some board members who are adamant campaign while skipping the feasibility study step. How can I convince them otherwise without upsetting them?
Well, that's a great question, and I should have said earlier that I have had some campaigns that did not do a feasibility study, but let me give you some examples of the ones who didn't do one and why they worked. One was an organization that was a private school, and they wanted to raise $12 million. Well, they had never done a capital campaign. And they were a fairly young school. They didn't think they had alumni that could give a whole lot. So they decided they were going to start with 3 phases. They were going to do a $7 million campaign in phase 1, and then they were going to do, I think it was like $3.2 million in the second phase, and then the last phase was like only $1 million or $8 million or something like that. Well, when they were getting ready to do their campaign, they didn't do a study for a couple reasons. First of all, it was a private school, and they decided the first phase of their campaign, which was actually going to be construction in the school. The second phase was athletics fields, which they could have done later. But the first phase, they said, we have to do this over the summer because we have to have the school open in September when the kids come back to school. So they had 3 gentlemen who co-chaired the campaign, or tri-chaired, I guess you'd call it. And each one of those 3 gentlemen had committed that they were going to give at least $1 million to the campaign. So they had just about half their goal raised with those 3 people. And they said, you know, we just don't have the time for a study. And I agreed with them. I said, I think you'd be wasting your money. It's going to push the project back a whole year if you do that, because of the time that you have to do construction. But they did it, and they were successful. And in fact, they raised the whole $12 million in phase 1. They didn't even have to do it in phases. But that's only because they had those 3 people who stepped up and not only made a personal pledge, but we knew they were people who had the clout. The one gentleman who gave the biggest gift was a great person and a great philanthropist, but we could not convince him to go out and ask others for money. He said, I just can't do that. So we knew he wouldn't be good at leveraging, but the other 2 said, you know, we can't give quite as much as he's giving, but we'll go out and talk to other people. And the one especially really worked his butt off. He was actually an attorney, and I said, I'm glad he's not my lawyer because he's probably spending all his time focused on this campaign and not much. But I guess he had plenty of other people to handle that. But
Hmm.
that one was successful. And I had another client who didn't have the time to do a study because it was in the northeast part of the country and their roof collapsed in the snow and they had to replace it because they couldn't function without it was a community center. And and they didn't have that, it was a smaller campaign, so it wasn't like they had to find that many millions of dollars, but they did have a board who was very committed, and they had a chairperson who especially was really committed to making this happen, and they did it successfully without a study. So it can be done, but I would say, here's some questions asked. Do we have some donors that could give us maybe, do we have a couple people in mind that could give us at least 10% of our goal? Do we have a strong annual fund that people have been supporting us year after year, and we know that they're going to do it? Do we have awareness in the campaign? And this is where probably some of your helpful information that you can give them, Greg, is maybe having them study their current existing donors and find out what their capability is. So there's sometimes when you can do it without doing a study. But I would ask, do you have major donors in mind that you're pretty sure are going to give this money, and have you already talked to them? And do you have leadership in mind? Do you know people that are going to lead this campaign, and are they the kind of people that can get donors to give? And then also let them know that it's probably going to take a little longer without the study because you're going to spend more time doing some of this research and identification.
Got it. Great. That was a very thorough answer, and I was not expecting that twist about a roof collapsing to be the reason.
Well, when people see an emergency situation like that, like I said, it was a community center, so everybody in the community was going to get behind it. So, but not every
Yes.
organization has that going for them. So.
Okay, so we got a couple more here. 40 to 50 questions. I'm sorry, interview questions. 40. I think what they mean is 40 to 50 interviews. Okay, let's say 40 to 50 interviews. I remember you saying, why interview so many people for a study?
Well, because you want to get a good cross section. You want to get people who you usually interview some of your board members, especially if you think they're going to be major donors, or if you think they're not in favor of this project and you want to, try to win them over. I always look at community leaders, at some of your volunteers. You really need a good cross section because, like, going out and interviewing 10 people usually doesn't give you the results that you need because it's just not enough of a cross section of a community. Now, maybe if it's the one campaign that I did that was less than 30 was a very small campaign for about $1 million. I think it was less than $1 million, and it was a small community library. And so we figured that we could probably get away with a few less than that. But in most cases, you need that good cross section to really get. Because if you could just go out and interview 10 board members, you're going to get probably the same answers from all 10 of them.
Right.
So you're going to get a good cross-section of people involved.
Okay, well, it looks like we've got one more. Oh, no, one more rolling in. So, and by the way, this is really a very interested group because hardly anybody has left. So either everybody's asleep there or people are really for holding on the line here. Okay, so the next one is, and thank you, by the way, again, Linda, for doing this. I know you're still not 100%.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I've had to cough and stop for water a couple times.
It's okay. It's okay. Okay. What type of document is required for securing and naming opportunity? And when secured, how long is a naming valid? And how do you explain that? And there's more. So I'll come back to that if you need me to repeat. Example, theater naming donor secured, theater renamed. 40 years down the road, the theater requires a major expansion and overhaul. can it be for a renaming? I hope that all that makes sense.
It can, as long as your original naming wasn't, well, probably if it's 40 years ago, maybe that donor isn't even on this earth, but their family member. Years ago, people would just name a building in perpetuity, but I think today it's becoming a lot more common to say this naming opportunity will last for 10 years or 20 years or whatever, because there are some times when buildings don't last as long as they used to. We're unfortunately not in building the pyramids in Egypt where you can go, 6,000 years later and the paint's still fresh on the walls. I was just blown away by that when I saw them. But one of the things that I think it's really important to have documentation, as you mentioned, that clearly outlines in the documentation, we're naming XYZ building or room after you for a period of 20 years. And for some people, that's great. If they want it named in perpetuity, then you probably want to ask them to endow that, because the upkeep of that building is going to need to get changed. So, maybe if in addition to giving you $3 million to name the building, maybe you want to ask them to set aside $1 million endowment, and you might be willing to name it in perpetuity. I've actually used this to my benefit with businesses. I was doing it wasn't a theater, it was an arts center, and they had a building, a room in their building that was named after a bank that had subsequently been acquired probably like twice and had two different names, but they still had the plaque on the wall that said it was sponsored by ABC Bank. So we went to XYZ, the bank that ultimately acquired them, and said, we'd like you to consider paying for the renovation of this room in the building, and then we'll put a new plaque in your name. So that worked out to our advantage. We were able to do that. And it might work out to your advantage where maybe people would, if the family members are still involved, they may want to make an additional gift to assure that that's going into perpetuity for their family member. So it's kind of a tricky situation, but I think the key that you said was have it documented, because you don't want to just name something after somebody who thinks it's going to be forever and then find out 10 years from now you want to rename it in somebody else's name. So make sure you're CYA, with all kind of documentation, and make sure everybody agrees with it.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I
These
hope
are some
that
great questions. I'll tell you, you have a great audience here.
Well, we've got one more, unless more roll in. It looks like Sarah just said thank you, so I think that you definitely. It sounds like you answered the question. Here's another one. I've only been working here for 1 year. We just completed a 5-year capital campaign, $2 million, and plan to launch a new campaign in the next few months to add a pool/spa. It's a retirement community. I feel the donors who are primarily residents are tired and may not be ready to give large amounts. I guess, again, is what she's saying, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably, you do have donor fatigue sometimes when you do too many campaigns. That's one of the things with the long-range planning, that if that had been in the works and you were even thinking about it, I usually try to, in the planning study, develop a case that is very encompassing, because it is hard to go back sometimes to have another campaign too soon. You might be able to find new donors maybe in the families of your residents or in other communities where maybe some of the medical professionals realize that the spa and pool are really going to provide a lot of health benefits for their patients, and so you might be able to find some new donors. But I wouldn't overrule that. I mean, I certainly would not ignore those existing donors. Maybe that's a good idea in your planning study, is to talk to some of those existing donors and see if they would be willing to contribute again.
Terrific. Well, unless there are other questions rolling in, I think this wraps up our webinar presentation. Are you ready for a capital campaign? And I want to thank everybody for participating, and especially you, Linda, for lending us your tremendous knowledge and experience. And of course, if those attending would like to learn, we can support you with either the data collection, the discovery, the lead generation, qualification, all that. We'd be happy to show you more. It's easier than you think. So that'll just about wrap it up. Linda, any final words?
Just I wish everybody success with their campaigns if you're in one or starting one or thinking about it, and also to let you know if you have questions that come up afterwards, feel free to email me. I always answer those questions. I just was on the phone this morning with somebody that was at a workshop I did about a month ago, and he had a question that came up, and I'm always here, so feel free to email me. And thanks so much to you, Greg, for this opportunity, too. It's fun.
It's a pleasure. All right, everybody, that wraps it up. Have a great day. Go close some gifts.
Bye.